jobs to be done can have strategic implications, but I think it can also just be something that teams use in a more simple way to help them think through problems that they need to solve in a different way. And I think that's the promise of jobs to be done at that level, is a mindset shift. And our last guest, Urko Wood, talked about that in his presentation. But it's not always straightforward to bring jobs to be done to your team. There's lots of challenges that you might have to overcome to get to that point. And that's what we're going to be talking about today: the practical challenges of overcoming bringing jobs to be done into your team. So with that, my name is Jim Callback. I'm the author of the Jobs to be Done playbook and co-founder of the Jobs to be Done toolkit.
Yeah, and I'm Elaine Mathias. I'm the other co-founder of the Jobs to be Done toolkit here with Jim. And welcome to our June edition of Jobs to be Done Untangled. I have a couple of quick toolkit announcements, and then I'll turn the floor over to Jim and Mike, and we can get started. Just a couple of things coming up in July. We're running a special workshop, Write Your Product's Resume. So kind of working with the idea of why would a customer hire your product or service? We're going to play around with that and write the resume that maybe your product would use to pitch itself to a customer looking to get a job done. So that will be Thursday, July 11th. The workshop itself is 2 hours, but we will stay on the line for another 30 minutes afterwards, and I can take questions, chat with people about jobs to be done. So please consider joining us. And then our next Untangled will be the last Thursday of July. That's the 30th. And I will post links to both of these in the chat.
Yep. All right. Thanks for that. Let's get right to our special guest, Mike Morgan. How are you today?
Doing well. How about you, Jim?
All right. Yeah, good to see you. We met, I don't know, how long ago did we met? I think we've known each other for over 5 years, right?
Yeah, around 2018.
2018, right?
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
You're a senior UX researcher at Bloomberg, right, in New York City?
Yep, that's right.
Okay, great. And I know you have a slide that tells a little bit more about yourself. So what I'm going to do then, to just hand it over to you, is I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then you can start presenting, Mike. If you have questions, put them in the chat. And what we're going to do is we're going to collect questions for Mike, and we're going to have a big discussion here after the presentation.
Great. So thanks, Jim, for having me speak. So today I was just going to talk about jobs to be done at my organization, Bloomberg. And I kind of framing it as finding the focus, because one of the primary challenges, which you'll see shortly, is around really trying to figure out what the heck that target job is. A little bit about myself first. So I've been in IT for over 20 years. I've kind of ran the gamut from very technical roles. I used to be a software engineer, front-end developer, moved into business analysis, product management. And now, for the past 15 years, I've been doing UX research. And this is where I am. This is where I am today. I've been working publishing, business services, consulting, and now I am here in finance. And most of my career has been in finance. I also have written a number of articles on UX research specifically in these publications you see listed here. As Jim said before, I'm a senior UX researcher at Bloomberg, currently supporting the flagship product, which is called the Terminal. If you think about, I like to use the analogy, the Terminal is like the Microsoft Office of the finance world. It's your productivity tool if you're a finance professional. It sits on practically every finance professional's desk. And just a little aside for hobbies, when I'm not doing UX research, love to run, love to read. There's some recent books on the right-hand side you see here that I'm currently reading and have recently read. And also I enjoy playing and learning jazz piano. And for jobs to be done, I'd say I've been using it on and off since 2016. First found out about it actually in one of Jim's books, where he talks about value alignment maps. I believe it's the Mapping Experiences book. And as soon as I started reading about it, I was immediately hooked. So I'm going to jump into some of the challenges for jobs to be done. I think one of the biggest ones, just to give you a little bit of perspective, it's not being used a whole lot at my company, but it's being used more and more. It's being asked actually to be used by product people are interested in it. They hear about it, they read about it, and kind of get excited about it. But at the same time, if you think about the majority of situations that I'm in, they don't know about it. So you have to kind of get that stakeholder buy-in to use it. And so you got to kind of take a step back. And what I often do is I sit back and I just kind of like explain what jobs to be done is. And I might show them a basic job map. So for example, I'm just going to jump around for a second. I might show them a very meaningful example like this to kind of drive home those key points. This is a job map of running in the morning to stay in shape. And these are the different phases of that job map and different job steps. And so I'll explain to them in a meaningful way. That way they can relate to it. And then what I'll do is I'll take it a step further and explain the value of jobs to be done to them to kind of drive home the point that, hey, we could create this job map to better understand our customers' problems, and then we can start honing in specifically on those problem areas by way of doing this research. And so going back to this slide, getting stakeholder buy-in is definitely a challenge. And the language too, there's such a specific language to jobs to be done. So oftentimes I feel like the human Rosetta Stone, where I have to kind of like translate UX language into jobs to be done language. So for example, like how you might describe like what an outcome is. And so you have to kind of think about, well, what's the UX language? Well, we have in the UX, we call them pain points, right? So maybe an outcome is something like a reframed pain point, you know? So trying to kind of build that scaffolding, that language between the two is something that I contend with. And then I already mentioned the intentional aspects of the framework, the rules, the syntax, and that's something that I also drive home when I'm introducing jobs to be done to stakeholders. And then lastly, you don't always use jobs to be done for a study, right? Like, so figuring out when to use it also is something very important and something I oftentimes have a conversation with my designers and stakeholders who are doing research about as well. So the second challenge, technically, if you were to weigh these in terms of like, what are the biggest challenges in descending order, this probably should be number one, I think. But identifying and scoping the target job is easily the hardest thing to do. Finding that right level of altitude to figure out, you know, where should I start from? And then also figuring out whether or not I need to add those contextual clarifiers or job differentiators to the statements. Is it too specific? Is it too broad? You know, are we missing something? Should we be including something? And that leads you down these, you know, inevitable rabbit holes. And so that's where you have to kind of figure out, well, let's take these as related jobs and put them on the side and worry about them later. So finding that that happy kind of like altitude is really a challenge. And oftentimes this is in the form of, you know, a stakeholder saying, can we include this? Can we include that? Can we include this? And then suddenly the scope of your job is like a hippopotamus, right? It's just huge. And so you have to find a way to kind of like carve it down in a way that's manageable, especially in your timelines, which is another challenge later on I'll talk about. And this one was kind of a surprise to me, but I was having a conversation with one of my colleagues who's using jobs to be done. Sometimes identifying the job performer can also be a challenge, which is really interesting. But it's true, it can be a challenge. And I'm going to talk about the language too, because this goes in with the stakeholder buy-in, right? Because if I don't know what the heck you're talking about, then why would I buy into it, right? So aligning on the right syntax and language with your stakeholders is so important. And I didn't know I was trying to think of the right metaphor, but it's almost like a terminology riptide, because what happens is over the years, I've read, a lot of the large, very important books in the framework. The terminology changes quite a bit, and so it could be a little bit confusing. While a job is a job, and I don't really think that's changed. An outcome is also, we call them need statements or error statements or desired outcomes. So trying to figure out which to use and sticking with it is a real challenge. So really considering your company culture, considering your stakeholders, what language makes the most sense for them to kind of like anchor into is a really important consideration. And then there's just so much out there, right? I mean, if you were to Google jobs to be done, you'll get all sorts of really neat things, but it's like, where do you start? What do you choose? This is a big challenge. So I just listed a bunch of, I just threw down a laundry list of a hodgepodge of tools and schools to figure out, like, well, where do you start? What do you use? So that's a big challenge too. And knowing what to use and when as well. I did want to point out a couple of my colleagues. They actually are using a job story, which is typically a communication tool at the end of your project to kind of convey, this is what we found out, in a nicely tight kind of like statement. They're using it almost in reverse, like reverse engineering it. They're saying, okay, here's a job story as a hypothesis. Let's validate this with the research. So super interesting approach. And it was their opportunity and their way of trying to engage in using this new framework. And frankly, it's been very effective for them. And I think they're going to continue probably trying to figure out how they can integrate more tools into their processes as well. So, it's almost like you got to start somewhere, right? So this is a good place to start. And I think this is my last challenge, and then we can open it up for conversation. This is the biggest challenge, and I'm sure this is a challenge for many of you on the call. It's time. Your projects typically are time boxed, and so trying to figure out a plan, because as a researcher, I feel like most of the research is actually just the planning of the research. It takes up so much time, but if you spend that time to do the planning, and when you're using a framework like jobs to be done, then you can then figure out what are all the tools and things you're going to do in that planning phase of your research, which is time boxed. And so for a project I had done relatively recently, it was a very large project. I used a job map, right? At a minimum, I used that job map. Unfortunately, I ran out of time and I couldn't get to all the other juicy stuff, the prioritization of the jobs and the outcomes, the surveys. I couldn't do any of that because I ran out of time. And so really having that planning phase and thinking about all the things you're going to do is really important. This is just an example of that job map that I had created. I kind of blurred it out for I guess legal privacy reasons. But here you can see this is just a job map that was created in that session with some mapping of the desired outcomes at the bottom here. This was a fairly large effort. And like I said, it was, I would say, moderately successful in the sense that it gave my stakeholders vision into where to focus. Unfortunately, I didn't have the opportunity to do all those other things I was talking about, but at least it was a starter point. And I know now, going into a future project, how I can plan for that prioritization exercise, right? After I do my job map and do all those things I need to do. So even though I've been doing research for 15 years, I am absolutely a student of jobs to be done and will continue to be a student because there's so much to learn. And there's so many things that you can benefit from in using this framework. I think that's it.
All right. Thanks for those real world challenges and stories. I have like a list of questions. I'm actually going to start off a little bit, Mike. I know we got some in the chat too, but if you have some questions for Mike. So I've struggled with this myself. And early on, when I got introduced in Jobs to Be Done in 2003 after reading Tony Olick's article in HBR, and I started to bring it into my own work. And the thing that I did at first was I didn't tell anybody it was Jobs to Be Done. I just overlaid it or integrated into what I was doing. And I'm wondering, when you say, the language and the terminology is, kind of confusing and stuff like this, why do you think you even need to say we're doing Jobs to Be Done now? Let me give a quick example. You said pain points map to outcomes. You could, I'm throwing this out there for discussion, you could say, hey guys, we're going to formulate pain points in this new way. Every time you have a pain point, formulate it this way. You know what I mean? And not even let them know, your stakeholders or your team, that it's this very rigid syntax and rule-based thing from Jobs to Be Done. Why did you feel like you needed to call it Jobs to Be Done and bring Jobs to Be Done in separately?
I don't know. I guess the cat was out of the bag at some point. So
Okay.
it didn't matter. But because I had, especially coming into Bloomberg, I had read, by the time I got in here, I had read, the really big, literature books in this field, and I was like, it's just like going around in my head, like, well, what's the right term? You always want to tailor your language to your audience, and your audience is so different. Right. So it's like you go through that process. So
yeah. But to be honest with you, they're the same thing, because the other book that I wrote is Mapping Experiences, and it's the same thing over there. Service blueprint, customer journey map, experience, and then if you actually look at those artifacts, what one person says is the opposite of what somebody else calls something as well too. So it's kind of a jungle out there. I think that might be kind of endemic to our field to some degree. There's a little bit of alignment, like a persona is kind of a persona universally, more or less. But even there, it's not. I've heard people talk about archetypes and things like that. So there's a lot of variation anyway out there, and I kind of feels to me like you got to navigate some of that anyway, particularly when you're talking about research, right?
Agreed. Yeah, it's so funny you bring up personas, because I was just in a meeting before, and we were talking about the use of personas, and the use of personas in the conversation was very different than what I thought a persona was. So it's I guess it doesn't matter what you call it, as long as you agree. As long as you agree on the thingamajig,
Right, I agree. Well, that's what I was suggesting, is that you can, within the culture and the current environment of your organization, thinking of stakeholders, you could come up with your own labels or your own. It's like, well, and I've actually advised people this. Maybe it's not a good thing to do, but like white label jobs to be done. And I've even, in fact, I'm talking to the guy that I told that to. Coincidentally, this afternoon, I'm talking to him. He had a big project, and he said, yeah, we can't take that label away. And I said, that's fine. Just call it that. But behind it, you're using all the Jobs to Be Done logic, right? So he basically white labeled Jobs to Be Done stuff. What do you think about that, Mike?
I love it. I think that's great. I mean, I'm kind of doing that ish on another project. So I think it makes sense. Yeah, I like it.
Okay. The other thing that I wanted, before we hand it over, and I see there's some questions coming in from Wolfram and others, this idea of focus and your target job gets knocked off centered, right? Because you'll go through like my process or whatever, the canvas Elaine and I made, and you got a target job, and then some stakeholder does a swoop and poop on it, as I call it, right?
Right, yeah.
No idea how you got there, and let's add this to it, and you're like, that totally changes the scope of my research. But I guess the question I had though was, anytime you scope research, that's going to happen to you, isn't it? So that's not necessarily a problem of Jobs to Be Done, is it?
Correct. It's the same problem. It's just like the different lens, I guess, right? Because if you're new to Jobs to Be Done, it's like this additional, it's almost like this additional mental adapter you have to have, right? Of like, okay, this isn't a unique problem, but in thinking about the way we think about Jobs to Be Done, we need to do it this way and not that way. So so you're right, though, it's just slightly different, but not the same.
Well, my hope was, with Jobs to Be Done and the book and the toolkit now too, was that Jobs to Be Done can help you bring that focus that you need, because it demands that target job. Right. And the reason why we call it target job is because it's a choice. right? It's what you're targeting for that research. And by framing it, you have to push back on the, what I call whataboutism. Like people say, hey, what about this? What about that job performer? What about this use case? What? And you could say, yeah, I need this thing here that's called a target job. And my hope was that helped you push back on it. I guess it's different for different organizations, but it sounds like there's a lot of prevailing forces against you there.
I think, yeah, but you know what? I think the more we get better about the use of the language of jobs to be done, and I think the more we get better about that, because we're not there yet. The more we get better about the language, I think the better we'll get at that.
Okay.
Because then we'll be like, then we have a rubric, right?
Right.
Right now, it's a little bit here, a little bit there, but
right. Our friends over at Venbridge, they actually call it a focus job, and maybe that's a good term too, because what you're asking your stakeholders to do is focus, right? And sometimes you just want to grab them by the collar and say, can we focus on one problem, right?
Yeah, that's kind of that's where. I mean, just mind reading here, like my title, "Finding the Focus." It's like, I mean, it's another term for target.
Right.
In some ways, focus is almost a better term. Not that I want you to change the language.
No. I think it is actually too. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that. We're going to go over to Wolfram because I see there's a couple questions and comments from Wolfram. You want to come on? You got your webcam today? Hey, there you go.
Sure. Sorry. Thanks, Mike. Very interesting. My first question would be related to your third or fourth challenge. I don't exactly remember. You mentioned regarding the term. So would you strictly stick to the term once you agreed on this, the term you use for outcome, or would you still say it's fine to change it depending on the people you talk to? Because I actually do this often. So depending on who I'm talking to the ones who know, I don't know, Tony Olvig or Jobs to be done, I call it outcome statements, maybe just a need. For others, it's a problem because they understand it's a problem. And sometimes I call it pain point. Not entirely correct when we discuss, but it's easier for them to understand. So that's why my question is, would you pick one term and stick to it in your company at least, or is it, from your perspective, okay to adjust?
Yeah, so behind that juicy question is a cultural consideration, right? And the question I'm asking myself when you ask that question is like, would a company like Bloomberg be cool with using different terms for the same thing, or would it make sense to align on one term and have everyone kind of have that conversation? I think, again, this is going to be year 6 for me at Bloomberg, so maybe I'll change my mind at year 12. But like, I feel like aligning on one term would be better where I work, because the level of collaboration where I work is fairly intense. And if you're working with one group and using one term, and you're working with another group and they're using a different term, it might be a little bit like confusing. But if we were not always working in collaboration with each other and we were working in these separate threads, it might make sense to tailor the term for the group that I'm working with. I hope that answer makes sense.
Yeah, so we call it need statements in general, and we always use the same, but when we talk about it, like just in conversations, I sometimes replace outcome or need statement with problem, because I have the impression it's easier for them to follow me. That's when I exchange these terms. But good point. Thanks.
I like that though. I mean, using that term problem is good. Yep.
Yeah, this is a pain point for me, and actually, I apologize to everyone on the call and in the world, because I've changed my language since I wrote the book, and I saw the field of jobs to be done. It's like, I'm gonna cinch things up here, and then I didn't. I think part of the problem there, though, too, is, and I've had this question to me posed recently, is like, who's in charge of jobs to be done? It wasn't quite posed that way. It's like, we all are, and that's why you get this all these kind of variations, just like in UX with journey mapping and all these other things as well too. And I don't know what the answer is. We can at the next council meeting for jobs to be done, we can put it on the agenda and see if we can get a definitive answer. But there is no such council, so I don't know exactly what the solution is.
Yeah.
Cool. Elaine, should we stick with Wolfram? I'm sorry, I'm not looking at the questions.
Wolfram has another question, and then Tarek had a question about
Okay.
using job stories and maybe talking about who benefits the most from mapping out a job story.
Do you want to go with that one? And go back to, okay, let's go to Tarek then, and then we'll come back to you, Wolfram.
And Tarek, feel free to come on and respond as well or join the conversation.
Hello, everybody.
Hey.
Hi.
Hi. A great session. Thank you so much for it. One of the things that I have often faced is when you're working with people and trying to explain jobs to be done to them, is how do you get down to telling a story about whatever it is that you're trying to solve or help them, realize. And so I found myself looking for and searching for information that allows me to integrate jobs to be done. And I'm absolutely not only a student, but I think it's just a greatest thing since sliced bread to storytelling. And Donald Miller has this thing about story brand, and so I tried to work it into that. And it just caught my attention that you mentioned story, telling a story through jobs to be done, and I wanted to know a little bit more about that and what your experience has been, and who benefits the most from your experience.
Sure. So job stories from my perspective is I think that I was talking earlier about translating UX into jobs to be done, and the job story is like a great translation in a way. If I am a UX designer, and I am writing something which is different, but it's kind of the same style, a user story, like when you're using Agile, for example, the concept of writing a contextual kind of like statement with a user and actions and context is something easy for designers to grasp. And so I think that's why my design colleagues at where I work at Bloomberg have kind of like latched onto something that feels familiar to them because of what it is. And so that's why they're using them, and they're using them in a unique way, because the job story is really intended to kind of like it's supposed to be like an outbound communication of what we learned in our research. They're using it as saying, this is what we think, let's validate this with the research, which is an interesting take on using a job story. I prefer, as a researcher, I'm not a designer, I feel like starting with the job and then all the language that goes around the job and all the tools that go with it as a starting point makes more sense to me. But that's me. I'm not a designer, but I can understand why a designer would want to start from a more familiar place than a researcher. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
And just another thought there too. I actually worked with a company that was using job stories as data collection. So when they were going out doing their interviews, they were capturing their insights as job stories, right? So that the unit of analysis, the insight, was very consistent in their database of insights, which is probably a spreadsheet, but their collection of insights were very uniform. So hypothesis. Using job stories for hypothesis, for data collection, and for communication tools, I think it's very versatile. I don't think any of those are wrong, though. Do you, Mike?
No, I don't think so. But it could be a little dangerous in the sense
Oh,
when you think about jobs to be done as, it needs to be stable over time, doesn't excludes technology,
yeah.
you're kind of violating that rule essentially. But but it's intentional, right? It's intentional because you're saying, okay, here's a solution in the job story.
Right.
But at the same time, as a researcher, to me that's like, ooh, wait a minute,
yeah, right, yeah.
But
right.
You're kind of like jumping to it's like you're jumping to like the end of the book. It's like
right.
So I understand why they anchor into it though, and I empathize with their point of view, but at the same time, I also want to encourage them to kind of start from the beginning. And not jump to those solutions, because the job story does contain that
that's right. You're
solution
right.
statement. That's my concern.
Good answer. Very good answer. Yeah. Let's see. Should we go back to Wolfram? I think there was another theme you wanted to bring in, Wolfram.
Actually, it was rather a rhetorical question. So if it actually really matters how you call it, as long as you solve the problem, because Mike discussed, is it a problem or a job to be done, or sometimes I call it even use case. So this was rather like, does it matter when you solve it? So
yeah,
it's just this fighting who is right with the right term, right? I don't think too important.
Actually, I would say it might matter, because if you want to go back later on and look at the research and look at what you did, because maybe you're going to do some subsequent research and maybe something related or similar, it might be interesting to have that traceability of what happened in the past. But I totally get your point, though. At the end of the day, it's about solving the problems.
Yeah, and that's kind of how I started the session off, talking about mindset shift, right? At the core. And again, we heard Urko Wood, our previous guest, talk about this, that one of the highlights of his consulting, and he's been doing it, jobs to be done for 2 decades, was when a customer said, "You helped us shift our mindsets," right? And it's like, well, as long as you assume that solution free, let's start at the beginning. Let's understand the problem before we jump into solutions, right? Which is a huge symptom that almost every organization I work with has, at some degree, that jumping into solutions before you understand the problem. And, as long as those things are there, rhetorically, Wolfram, you're practicing some version of jobs to be done, I think, right? So, and that, that's the important thing, I guess. However, obviously I wrote a book, and Elaine and I have a school around jobs to be done. So we want it to be consistent and repeatable as well, too. And I can imagine for you, Mike, as a senior researcher there, you also want some kind of repeatability with your teams as well, too. And if you onboard somebody new, there's that learning and things like that, right?
Agreed. Yeah, that's why we're at such a nascent stage that it's, we're not there yet. I mean, I love the fact that people are trying different tools in different parts of it. It's so great, because then they can see what's working, what's not working, and then refine it. But I guess what you call a program does not exist as of yet here for it. That would be golden, to get to that point where it's like, okay, this is what you do, and this is what you do. Really,
right.
Your whole process, really, right? Like, target, investigate, scope.
Yeah. Well, so what's your goal, or what's your intent, maybe is a better word, of bringing jobs to be done to your research teams there?
I think for me, I think it's a language and it's a framework that your product people can understand. And because it's so understandable to who are essentially your primary stakeholders, right, for the research, at the end of the day, it's the product that's going to get built. They're the ones who need to be convinced. They're the ones who need to know. And using jobs to be done, I feel like, is the best way to reach that audience. And that's why I like it so much. Its simplicity, the metaphor itself, it's very powerful.
Right.
And that's why I latched onto it early. And that's why, and frankly, people are coming to me where I'm working and going, hey, we want to use this. And it's like, well, okay, that's nice, but let's figure out what are you trying to do? You know,
Right. Yeah.
like any research study, right? Like any research study, you got to take a step back and figure
Sure,
out
of course,
what are your goals, what are your questions, all that good stuff.
Are you finding that people are coming to you with the jobs to be done language already?
Some of them are.
Not that they've heard it elsewhere, right? Is that kind of thing?
In some cases, it's you know, people who have some research experience and they're coming with more fully formed jobs and ideas and maps and things like that. In other cases, it's like, you know, here we just, you know, we want to use this framework. We heard it's good. We read a bunch of articles on it, but that's all we know.
That's
and
all
then
you
it's
know,
like,
right? Okay.
And I was like, okay, well, let's make sure you have time to kind of like get ramped up to learn.
Right.
I wouldn't throw jobs to be done at someone who has a very tight timeline who you know, there's a learning curve attached to that, right? So it's I'm a little careful about when they should be using it and where they are in their journey of learning it, you know.
Yeah, that's great. Speaking of that, Teresa has a question about learning jobs to be done. Do you want to come on here, Teresa, and ask your question?
Hi, yeah, sure. I do product strategy and work with the product development team, and I'd love to start applying the jobs to be done framework in general. But both me and the team that I'm partnering with are sort of new to actually using the tool. We understand the concept and we are eager to try it out. I just wonder what's the best way to start so that it's easy for us to kind of learn and try it out.
So I think the biggest first step is to just spend some time reading some books on it. I mean, there's a couple of obvious ones if you're not familiar with them, but there's obviously Jim's book, The Playbook, but there's I actually have it on my desk. I don't know if he's on the call, but I always recommend this book, The Statue in the Stone. But books that will give you a foundational understanding of what it is before you start kind of like putting pen to paper or whatever you want to call it, because you want to wrap your head around the concepts first before you start actually using it. Otherwise, you might lose your sense of orientation around what you should be doing and when you should be doing it. So I would highly recommend you read, you know, some of the big books on jobs to be done. Yep.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Teresa. And Paige had a specific question about jobs to be done and using traditional agile story mapping with product teams. Are you familiar with story mapping, Mike? Jeff Patton?
I've heard of it. I don't remember specifically.
Okay.
Yeah.
What were your thoughts there, Paige?
So I'm a consultant. I'm a UX consultant, and I hop from client to client, right? And I'm right now working with a client who has, and honestly still does not put a lot of value investment into UX. So I'm just slowly trying to make my way in and prove the value with them. And they're also going through an agile transformation where they're being taught to use story mapping with the product teams. Add another layer of complexity. It's a Les framework, which Les doesn't even believe in UX. So that's a fun thing for me. But I'm just trying to understand at the beginning of my engagement, we did a jobs to be done inventory with a group of stakeholders and users. And then they hit the ground running doing story mapping with product teams. And I'm like, hey, wait, guys, we have a bunch of jobs to be done inventory. But it's hard for me to keep a handle on all of these teams that are now running in different directions and bringing them back to the jobs to be done, which the story map that I'm used to in the Agile framework looks probably similar to the job mapping that was shared here. We are just not considering that. And when I say we, the product teams are not considering the jobs to be done prior to going into the story mapping, which makes me feel icky from a UX perspective because that's not user-centered design. That's product stakeholder-centered design. So just curious if anybody has ever, married those two concepts together.
I have a thought on it's a great question. A user story map for me is often a tipping point between like journey mapping and other UX work and agile development, but I don't know how those two things matched. Story mapping and jobs to be done actually work together. It's a really interesting topic. So if for those of you who don't know, a guy named Jeff Patton wrote a book called User Story Mapping, and it kind of has the opposite function of a job map. Because what a job map does is it describes getting the job done independently of technology and solutions, right? A user story map is exactly the opposite. Is we have to build this thing, usually software, but we have to build this thing. Let's describe the use of that thing as a kind of a journey. And by that, I mean a chronological sequence of steps, right? So a user story map is a chronological sequence of steps, but it's things like log into the system, conduct a search, look at the results list, download an article, and things like that. It's very, very detailed and very, very solution specific, because that's the job of a user story map, is to describe the thing you're going to build. So for me, it's kind of like yin and yang, or two sides of a coin almost, Paige. And I kind of feel like, like you said, that icky feeling, the jumping, going to user story map is jumping to the solution too quickly in my book. I mean, depending that, stopping and saying, let's look at the job map and how does our project fit into the individual's world is different than we have this thing, how do the individuals use it, right? So for me, they're very opposite. So I think that's why in my mind, they haven't really intersected, Paige, I'm sorry to say.
I mean, maybe you could overlay the job into a series of user story nodes or whatever, right? And that's what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Yeah.
That was kind of my hunch too, Mike. I'm glad you said that. But I've never thought about it further than that. So for me, Paige, it's just these things are separite. Like, let's keep those over there and those over there.
It's like anti-jobs to be done.
but Mike, to your point though, is like, I mean, I guess jobs to be done isn't peanut butter that you can just overlay on top of everything. But there might be a way to do that, Mike. I just haven't found it yet, Paige.
Well, thanks, guys, for thinking about it with me.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. That's what we're here for.
Tanya, interesting contributions in the chat around the use of language and how we use it to create a reality and connect with our peers. Tanya, do you want to come on and share some of those thoughts?
Hi.
Hello, friends. I'm super stoked to see this continuing conversation since we last chatted about language and jobs to be done. And so basically, I was just pointing out, the point that Mike mentioned earlier about how cultural this is. And when you think about the social components in terms of how we talk, the constructionism is occurring as we talk. And when we use words to connect with one another to create these systems of shared meaning, right? And how symbolic those words are of something greater, something bigger. So these words and language are creating a reality in such a way that the way that we're interacting, the way that we use words that we choose, and ultimately how it's contributing to a narrative. Right. So, and I think the question is, how are we, I'm a strategist, so I work in research. Sometimes it's user experience. So talking about journeys and things like that, but, cart before horse, how do we do this? And ultimately, how are we socially constructing in our strategies? And what are the words that we are in language to create in a new narrative and the next realistic conversation ultimately.
Yeah. So thanks, Tanya. And by the way, Tanya was a guest, and we talked about language around jobs to be done. So thanks for coming back here. So as a field, I think one of the problems, just to kind of frame that conversation we had earlier, is like, should the field of jobs to be done give us all the language you know what I mean? That common language, or should it be, as Mike was suggesting, a little bit more shape shifting? So, when Mike was talking about culture, I think, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, you were talking about the culture within Bloomberg, right?
Yes, that's
which
right.
also has its own social constructs and reality, right?
Right.
Do you think, Tanya, that this language should be more universal and foundational from the field of jobs to be done? Or is it okay that people make up their own realities? Because the reality is they have their own realities. You know what I mean? Right? You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think that goes back to what we were chatting about 3 months ago, because specific terms or phrases associated with the job steps for target jobs might be overlooked or misinterpreted by businesses just based on their culture and background and experiences. And so, when you think about how we're basically contributing to creating job steps and driving that realistic dialogue, and yet, taking into account everyone and their contributions. And so where do we land? Right.
Right. Yeah.
And ultimately, the jobs to be done have to perhaps evolve as we move forward. We can't always just rely on history, like, oh, we used to do this and it worked fine then 400 years ago. It's got to be evolving.
Yeah. Language is fluid, right? I mean, language has changed over time. So, yeah, that's good. Thanks for bringing that perspective in, Tanya. That's fantastic, as usual.
Thanks.
Cool. Do we have any more questions? Sorry, I'm getting distracted here, Elaine, today.
We're on track.
Okay.
The sort of the conversation on terminology is continuing in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see. Dominic, did you have a point that you wanted to make? Or question?
Yeah. Thanks for taking me.
Yeah, sure. Hey there.
Yeah, I found to several things here, is that it's a little bit harder to relate the terminology and align with people who have just a strictly human factors, human-centered interaction, that type of design coming into UX. But where people have some broader experience, maybe better, find more relatable to the product managers and people with broader market research, who might have some exposure to things like Six Sigma. I think there's a lot of great alignment with Six Sigma, or even older school Baldrige, kind of criteria and things like that. But the point I was just making too about some of the things being discussed was that design thinking has the double diamonds, right? Where you first you first settle and agree on what is the problem we're solving. Let's be clear about the problem we're solving. And Jobs to be Done is excellent for that. I think, the best tool, right? Along with other things. And then you figure out, well, how's the best way to solve it? And that's where, we started talking about some of the user story mapping or other thing, journey mapping things about, how does somebody go about this, and how would our technical solution, or whatever solution address that? And so, I really try to separate that into phases of research, right? So the first one seems to be more product manager driven about the strategy, and I've viewed Jobs to be Done strategy more with teams that are trying to get clarity on like a 3-year strategy, like a longer term, bigger picture strategy. And where do we start now? Why should we prioritize some things this year, or in the minimum viable product, or whatever that we're delivering first, and prioritize a roadmap of things over a longer term. And then the second part tends to be more design team focused, design and engineering coming into the picture, of course, working with all the teams, along the whole journey. But design seems to be a better lead in how are we solving and how we're mapping everything out, how it's going to function in the user interface and stuff.
So for those of you who don't know, the UK Design Council, about 20 years ago, in fact, they just celebrated the anniversary of the double diamond. They came out with this model that has 2 diamonds next to each other. One is the problem space and the other is the solution space. And you diverge and converge, and then diverge and converge. There's a lot more dynamics there, but I encourage you, if you don't know about the double diamond, to go out and look about the double diamond. There's precursors to that as well too, but in this day and age, I'm glad you brought it up, Dom, because it's kind of the model that a lot of people point to. And my mind was going there as well too, as we were talking about some of these things too. But I'd like to, Mike, I'm sure you're familiar with the double diamond. We actually didn't talk about this, but what is your take on the relationship of jobs to be done to that double diamond model?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the double diamond is something we definitely try to align ourselves to at Bloomberg. The double diamond is, we have our specific discrete parts, and we know it gives us our orientation of where we are in the process. So jobs to be done, as Dominic was saying, absolutely at the very beginning, when we're talking about trying to understand the problems and framing those problems, jobs to be done is just gold. And then moving along, when you have more specific solutions in mind that you want to test, I'm actually curious to know, and I'm sure there's some stuff in your book on it, but like how you can use jobs to be done in those later stages, Yeah. But we also think about it in two. You can even zoom out a little more and say, well, the left side of the diamond, at Bloomberg we think about building the right thing, and then everything on the right hand side is about building the thing right. And so we think about it that way too. That's another way we think about where we are in the process.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually have a figure 8 in the beginning of my book, because that's the way I organize the plays in the playbook, which is basically a double diamond redrawn as a figure 8, more or less. So I do talk about some of those more solution-y types of things, but I talk about them more in like almost go to market, which I don't even know if that's part of the double diamond, but that kind of thing. And then I put a redevelop in the middle. I think part of the problem with the double diamond is that people look at it as a linear process, and I wanted to say that this is ongoing. But to your point, I think we started to answer one of the questions that you posed, which was when to use jobs to be done. And I think it's for strategic things that have open end that you're uncertain about, right? Yep. The other thing I would throw out there too is when you need to differentiate. Again, Urko Wood last time he was talking about jobs to be done is a way to differentiate, right? So if you're just copying something or you're just delivering something and you kind of know what it needs to do to get out the door, that might not be a good project for jobs to be done. It's usually strategic differentiation. So if you have an effort that needs strategic differentiation, jobs to be done is probably a great place to start.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. All right. Thanks for that, Dom. I appreciate you coming on here. Elaine, I don't see any other questions. So if that's all, I know, Mike, maybe we can give you a final word here. Any other words? This was great, by the way. A lot of very practical advice. Any other words of wisdom for the group before we end here?
Just to say, we're early on in our journey in adopting the framework, and then maybe like, I don't know, 2 years, I'm just making this up, 2 years down the road, I can come back to you and share with you maybe some more, more structured, more kind of like put in place, institutionalized aspects of how we're using jobs to be done. Right. I would look forward to presenting that.
Oh, okay. Well, Elaine, I think we're starting to line up guests for future episodes. Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate the insights. Everybody, I appreciate your questions and the dialogue as well too.